When Prince Harald V of Norway heralded in the Norway Pavilion 6 years after the opening of Epcot, the pavilion was nothing but interconnected shops, a Dutch-styled bathroom, a couple of trolls, and the stave church. There was no ride to be seen. The doors were shut tight. But then, 2 months later, on July 5th, 1988, the Maelstrom was open to the public. Closing 26 years later, it's now an extinct attraction, and its creation and history, legacy, and demise is all going to be folklart, or rather explained, in this Disfarers episode. Alright, so the area for the Norway Pavilion was initially planned to be a Nordic pavilion that combined elements from the Scandinavian countries of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. But as the project moved forward, only Norway was left standing as an investing sponsor, so we all got the Norway Pavilion. This meant that the attraction for the now Norway Pavilion was going to focus on, well, just Norway. What's surprising is that even though Norway and/or some of its larger companies was going to pay for the attraction, Disney got overexcited and went right to work on designing the attraction without bothering to speak to a single Norwegian. And as it turned out, the design for Maelstrom was a winding mountainous road littered with obstacles and deviating detours. The fact that it all came together at all is a testament to the dedication of everyone involved. Marty Sklar, who did so much he's tough to narrow down his accomplishments, but he did go on to become the head of Walt Disney Imagineering. His scope at the time was a top creative executive over Epcot, and thus the Norway Pavilion, among many other things. He was a busy, important man. However, Marty played a pivotal role at the more critical times during Maelstrom's development. And though I have no idea whether this was a Marty Sklar decision or not, Joe Rohde was handed the role of art director over the Norway Pavilion attraction. Which is pretty surprising. Joe Rohde only started at Disney 3 short years earlier, elevating himself with each project he worked on across the design and construction of Epcot. He was just awesome though, a great designer. If you're not familiar with Joe Rohde, he went on to become one of the lead designers of Disney's Animal Kingdom. Like, the whole park, not just a land or single attraction or anything. Okay, so after Joe became the Norway attraction's art director, he went all in on Norway. He gathered all kinds of books about the country, history, and culture, and that includes its folklore. And according to Imagineer Mark Rhodes, a Disney Imagineer/writer, the attraction started out with Joe Rohde's idea for a day in the life of a Viking concept, like really going through the 24 hours in the daily life of a Viking. And if you listen to Mark Rhodes talk about it, Joe Rohde's concept was apparently astonishingly great and thoroughly researched. Joe even summed up his version of the attraction as a 15-minute pirate ride, but with Vikings as they set up a village and performed a burial, really digging into and sharing their lives. After enough suitable development time, Joe Rohde had to pitch his concept to Michael Eisner, Frank Wells, and Jeffrey Katzenberg. Joe was in the middle of giving a full rundown with storyboards when suddenly Katzenberg interrupted and said something along the lines of, yeah, that's nice, but what's the hook? Apparently, they were waiting for something to really grab them. I've also read that during this time at Disney, there was a lot of emphasis on what was going to hook people, as in, what was going to draw crowds. And again, this is Mark Rhodes' version of the story, who was there. Joe Rohde improvised on the spot that halfway through the ride, a troll was going to seize the guest boat and twirl it around, and that the rest of the ride would move backwards. Which apparently very much pleased Eisner, Wells, and Katzenberg. Up to this point, Joe Rohde's script had 2 Vikings merely mentioning a troll. It was a side dialogue, so yeah, he improvised the idea. Yet he went on to come up with all of the designs and tone of the trolls and fantasy elements, really bringing it all together. Joe Rohde, however, fatefully, was moved to another job that higher-ups wanted him on, and that made Bob Kurzweil, whom there are 0 pictures of that I could find, by the way, so we're just going to use the white rabbit to represent Bob Kurzweil in this episode, seeing as how he was also the designer of Disneyland's Alice in Wonderland dark ride. Anyway, so Bob Kurzweil was the new art director for Maelstrom. Bob Kurzweil, like so many during the 80s, was very much into fantasy. When he heard what Joe Rohde came up with, he grabbed onto the troll concept and ran headlong with it, literally stating that nobody cares about Vikings and that they were going to do the whole show on trolls. Trolls, trolls, and more trolls. I'm uncertain if it was during Joe Rohde's time as art director or Bob Kurzweil's, probably both. But it's widely believed that John Bauer's illustrations were an enormous inspiration during this portion of the designing, a Swedish artist during the 1900s who has heavily influenced how such creatures are imagined the world over. And I don't mean to besmirch Bob Kurzweil's team's designs in any way. They were pretty fantastic, with not only mystical lands and trolls, but also a rainbow bridge to Valhalla. So the design team moved on from Vikings to dedicate their research to Norwegian trolls. The whole show under Bob Kurzweil was trolls from beginning to end apparently, sprinkled with other Nordic folklore. I also think it was around this time that the Sherman Brothers were contacted to write a song for Norway's attraction. The same guys that wrote It's a Small World, The Tiki Room, One Little Spark, essentially all of Mary Poppins, and tons more. They were on board to write a song for Maelstrom. Now, after Norway became the sole country sponsoring the pavilion, Norwegian representatives flew in to speak to Disney. When I say representatives, I mean a bunch of differing Norwegian companies that had come together to sponsor the Norway Pavilion, calling themselves Norshow. Which I know sounds weird, but that's what they were really called. So Norshow comes in and Marty Sklar, the man himself, presents them with Kurzweil's troll concept, and Norshow hated it. They weren't interested in Bob Kurzweil's mythical elements and troll attraction. So, thinking on his feet, Marty went ahead and pitched Joe Rohde's Viking concept, and Norshow hated that too. They replied that they were not Vikings, nor were they trolls. They flatly stated that they were Norway. They're about the North Sea oil rig drilling platforms, to which none of the Imagineers at the meeting knew how to respond. Now you may wonder why Norway wanted to highlight these industrial oil rigs, and it's because all three began operating in the 1980s, the last of the three being operational just around the time of Maelstrom's opening. The country of Norway insisted on these being in the attraction because they had just recently commissioned and constructed them, and were extremely proud of the technological achievement. It was a great source of national pride. So, Norshow explained that they wanted to go in a different direction. They wanted to promote tourism to their country, which makes total sense. And they wanted the attraction to also cover Norway's natural wonders, the fjords, the history, outright using the words fishing village, polar bears, and conceding to Vikings, and maybe a troll or two. And I want to add that this all took place a day or so after the Sherman Brothers were brought on board and shown models and some troll concept art. They hardly got the chance to even get to work on developing a song. I don't even know how you say no to having the Sherman Brothers. It's lingonberries. So apparently, Mark Rhodes, who was there at the time, says, even after the meeting with Norshow, Bob Kurzweil was still hung up on trolls and insisted they were going to do the troll version of the attraction anyway. Which sounds a bit strange because Bob Kurzweil is often credited with combining the elements that ended up being the Maelstrom attraction. However, Bob was pulled off of the project. Mark Rhodes found himself the last man standing alone in a boreal wilderness, as it were, with Marty Sklar ordering him to come up with something that worked for everyone. Now, Norway's premise and scope was a bit too broad, which meant the idea had to be compressed into a journey that required narration. And as far as the more modern aspects that Norshow wanted, it was decided that it would be covered in a short theatrical film I'll go over in more detail shortly. So, putting his writing skills to use, Mark Rhodes spliced the Viking and troll concepts while inserting Norshow's input. Given the parameters set by Norshow and the fact that he needed to stick with them in exchange for funding not only the attraction, but the pavilion itself, it's safe to say Mark felt a lot of pressure. He knew Norshow wanted the drilling platform, so he worked and tweaked and struck upon the Maelstrom scene. I'm assuming it was him. I can't figure out who else was left that could have devised the epic scene. Mark claims he was the one who essentially had the attraction traverse time, from Norway's folklore to its present, or rather, what was the present in the 1980s. He also threw in polar bears, because they were brought up, and why not, right? As this grew more disjointed and convoluted, he saw that the ride would need a narrator, as I said. And since Hollywood hadn't fully discovered Morgan Freeman as of yet, he decided upon using Odin for the narration. Though it admittedly wasn't the smoothest of concepts and transitions, it met Norshow's criteria and would entertain and educate Epcot's guests. And as it turned out, everyone loved the script and the finalized design work. Norshow was happy, Disney was happy, everyone was happy.
Well, hallelujah.
The modeling work for Maelstrom was mostly done by Paul Torrigino. He was brought in while Bob Kurzweil was the art director. The two had worked together on Disneyland's Alice in Wonderland attraction, so Paul was a natural enough choice. When the project team was sent to Norway to gather research, Paul had hoped to join, but Marty Sklar put a halt to that, stating that a modeler had never gone on a research trip before and didn't want to set a precedent by sending one just then. However, the team brought Paul Torrigino a lot of good source material to work from. Maelstrom also had some of the last modeling work done by Jack Fergus, whom I can only locate a single photo of where half of his face is impeded by Roly Crump. But anyway, Jack was one of Disney's original Imagineers. For Maelstrom, he built the model for the Langskips, which were later replicated in fiberglass for the attraction. I wasn't lying, by the way. This isn't Jack Fergus. It's Paul Torrigino showing off Jack's boat. And Jack Fergus also sculpted the polar bear maquettes as well as some other fishing boats throughout the attraction. I also tried to find out who did the voice for Odin, but given that the audio was recorded in Norway and was likely a Norwegian voice actor from decades past, that piece of information is hard to come by. Putting together all of the differing elements and themes for Maelstrom was a tad chaotic, though I imagine all attractions have chaotic construction problems. Unlike poor Paul Torrigino, Mark Rhodes was on the Disney research visit to Norway, not only getting his hands on all kinds of incredible research for the script, but putting together multiple recordings for the attraction. As it turns out, the Oslo Philharmonic Orchestra was actually acquired to record all of the music for Maelstrom, which was a pretty big deal. The Norwegian Symphony Orchestra dates back to 1847, and during these years, due to its musical director Maris Janssens, it had struck an enormous international stride with impeccably high standards. So yeah, the Oslo Philharmonic Orchestra recorded all of the music for Maelstrom. It's really amazing. As I said, there were other recordings to be done while in Norway, so Mark also oversaw the recording of Maelstrom's dialogue. A university professor in Norway actually translated the script for the recording sessions, though the professor also goofed and forgot to translate it to an older form of Norwegian the Vikings would have used, so the dialogue had to be recorded over again in the proper vernacular. When Mark Rhodes returned to the United States from his big Research Norway expedition, he was informed that due to budget cuts, the 15-minute boat ride was to be cut clean in half down to 7.5 minutes. Being a great team player, Mark changed the script to fit the time. By now, the construction was literally running around the clock. The audio animatronics, sound, installation, backgrounds, boats, people, all of it was in non-stop production. Then the boat people told Mark that the boats kept moving too fast, and there was no way to slow it down any further. Therefore, they needed Mark to shave the script down to a smooth 5 minutes to compensate for the speed issue. So Mark cut it down to 5 minutes, and the boat people came back again and said the boats were still moving too fast. So Mark cut the script down again. It seems like Mark would have or should have argued about this, but there's no mention of it, nor was it mentioned anywhere in my research exactly what the problem with the boats actually was, by the way. Maelstrom was a ride called a Shoot the Chutes water flume. My best guess is that the bigger drop, which is twice the length of Pirates of the Caribbean's, was the cause for the speed issue, but that's just me speculating. It's a shame that the ride had to be cut back so much over a single prickly issue. Also, the track isn't that long, and I don't recall Maelstrom being all that fast. Given the numbers here, that meant that the attraction was originally going to move at less than 1/3 the speed guests experienced. I'm sure it's no surprise to anyone, but Maelstrom was reimagined into Frozen Ever After. However, they never altered the track or the drops, and that ride runs an average of 5 minutes. Unless the stop sequences were scripted to be much longer, I can't fathom how Maelstrom was supposed to run for 15 minutes, yet I believe Mark Rhodes' story. Anyway, Mark Rhodes went ahead and cut the script down to 3.5 minutes. But because the audio had already been recorded in Norway, and there was no quick way of re-recording it, they actually had to physically cut a copy of the audio tape with razor blades, and scotch tape them back together just to figure out the timing. Then they had to go back to Norway to record it again. I'm assuming it was looked over by the same professor to properly translate it, recut it again in California, and that's how the world got the Maelstrom audio. The Viking figures were created by Peter Kermode, who had become the head of the modeling department after Blaine Gibson retired. Disney's most iconic sculpting was done under Blaine Gibson, in case you don't know who he is. He worked on the sculptures for Pirates of the Caribbean, The Haunted Mansion, Lincoln from The Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln. You get the point. Anyway, Peter Kermode worked under Blaine during that era, so the modeling team was in excellent hands in the 1980s. It's said that Peter Kermode had really gotten into the Norwegian spirit with the three-headed troll, going so far as creating trolls and goblins just for himself. As I alluded to earlier, fantasy was really big in the 1980s. But anyway, the rich artistic details of Peter Kermode's three-headed troll were unfortunately obscured by the lighting effects, beards, and hair. But beneath all of these were wrinkles, warts, ears, and deeper expressions. It's a shame it wasn't brought more to the forefront to be appreciated. And there wasn't much information to be found about the audio animatronics other than that they were brought in from pre-existing molds left over from World of Motion and Spaceship Earth. I would have assumed that the three-headed troll would have been built exclusively for the attraction, but all signs indicate otherwise. In fact, there really wasn't anything exactly innovative about the technology used in creating Maelstrom. Really, outside of the fantastic art design, the attraction wasn't anything innovative or game-changing from what Disney had done in the past. It was a dark boat ride with a drop and audio animatronics. Though there was the introduction of black lighting and the whole backwards bit, but the design and theming was really what made the attraction stand out, maybe also seeing the butt end of the boat from the queue. The boats, like I mentioned, were modeled by Jack Fergus. He patterned them as a smaller version of these extraordinary Viking ships called langskips, roughly 10th century. While a real langskip was 50 feet or more, Maelstrom's langskips were 16 feet in length. The boats were cut above Disney's vessels of the past. There's much more attention to theming and detail. You really felt like you were hopping aboard a wooden vessel, and people loved that the front was designed as a dragon, though I feel anyone could just as easily have called it a snake, which Vikings were said to have also put on the front of their boats. I even read people claiming that Disney's langskips had sails, but this unfortunately wasn't true. It really would have been something to see if they did though, but yeah, no. Anywho, once all of the figures and sets were ready to go, according to Paul Torrigino, he was the art director during the installation and actual construction of Maelstrom. Or at least one of them. Since they were all working off of Paul's models as a guide, it does make some sense, and this construction and installation process took the better part of 9 months. And apparently, this was news to me, Maelstrom had a VIP conference area above the attraction called the Norway Club. That's it, that's all I could find out, other than that it was used quite a bit in the earlier Maelstrom years. A corporate VIP conference area I'd never heard about, just like the ones at Spaceship Earth and Space Mountain. However, I can't find any pictures. I can't say where it was, I can't say how big or small it is, I can't say if it's still there and being used in some other capacity. And I'm not getting it confused with the Florida Blue Lounge in the Akershus Royal Banquet Hall. If you're someone who happens to have any information on this, please take a moment to comment, because I'm really interested in learning more. The queue was not exactly inspiring at first glance. However, it had a map depicting the routes of the great age of the Vikings, and it had a gargantuan and really interesting mural done by Terry. That's the only name I got was Terry. I couldn't find the last name of who painted something so enormous at Epcot. It's really very strange. Anyway, as fantastic as the mural was, all everyone ever seemed to talk about was that Terry put mouse ears on one of the Vikings. I think Terry made a great mural. He supposedly painted himself in here somewhere, but I don't know who they are. This Terry also painted in Bill Anderson, the head of Disney mural painters, to be the one holding the wheel here. Despite the years involved, you can see the resemblance in the nose and around the eyes. And Paul Torrigino's retelling was incredibly vague, so I'm not sure if it's Terry's daughter or Bill Anderson's daughter, but one of their daughters was the model for the crew woman of the cruise ship. In any case, the mural wrapped around the curved walls of the queue area, enveloping guests like schoolbread around its delectable custard filling. The mural provided a neat, concise glimpse of Norwegian history, starting on the left with their Viking heritage to the robust, outdoorsy lifestyle they enjoyed at the time of the mural's creation. But otherwise, it was a classic back-and-forth queue to get to the langskips.
You are not the first who has this name.
Once settled into their boats, Voyagers ascended up a dark tunnel towards a visage of Odin with his watchful eye lighting the way, as well as introducing his narration.
Those who seek the spirit of Norway face peril and adventure, but more often find beauty and charm.
The lift moved Voyagers along into a Viking scene, retaining Joe Rohde's original design of displaying everyday life, if briefly. Paul Torrigino says he made tons of tools and stuff for this scene while it was in the modeling phase, but when Marty Sklar and Randy Bright came down to review it, Randy Bright told Paul that it looked like a parking lot sale at a Kmart. Ironically, when Maelstrom's initial production began in 1988, Kmart saw both its best year and worst disastrous decline. After the Vikings came the first troll, known as a Jotun. Though North Show said they were okay with a troll or two, someone came up with the ingenious idea to sneak in 3 by having a 3-headed troll. Technically, that could be argued as 1, I suppose. The three-headed troll scene was jarring for some people, including children, which makes me wonder if it's why the automatronic wasn't so overly animated. It was really great, but somehow restrained, and it originally had some heavy smoke effects that were also toned down years later. Maybe it was just ahead of its time. Although, a second troll also makes a brief appearance, so large that only its head is visible. This creature is known as a Nokian, a water creature of sorts that lures people and children to the water's edge. I suppose to drag people down to the water's depths. It's also said to be able to turn into other things, like beautiful women, handsome men, an old wood boat, tree stump, or a horse. No matter the case, the Nokian is a shape-shifting, ugly monster with talents in music that wants to drown people. The swamp itself was kept very simple, but I couldn't figure out why. Given the time and age and other productions at the time, I don't understand why Imagineers settled on it being a predominantly painted backdrop. I get that every project has to work within a budget, but this was the main scene. The backwards boat, the best animatronic, it was Joe Rohde's Hook. I know the Jim Henson Company and Disney didn't start having conversations until a year after Maelstrom debuted, but really, Disney had worked with Picasso, Salvador Dali, they got Ray Bradbury for Spaceship Earth. It feels like there should have been a serious design consultation somewhere during the process. But anyways, disturbed by the presence of humans, the troll cast a spell that pushed the boat backwards, shouting for them to disappear! Disappear! And back over the pond! So the troll's goal was to get rid of the guests. This backward sequence, again, was the hook, mind you, and it was really fun. Gliding backwards, Voyagers sped past a faraway, mystical-ish castle before suddenly in the midst of polar bears, which was a bit startling. But then again, there was also a cub and some puffins, so people would feel a bit relaxed. And then there's a 10-foot-tall polar bear bearing overhead, which was terrifying again. So there were many up and down emotions going on. This tundra-esque scene moved guests into a forest grotto with natural light, a really nice backdrop that was surprisingly better than the hooks, along with the ominous sound of rushing water. So as Voyagers were mentally preparing themselves for a drop, they found themselves moving backward toward the natural light. Which, of course, everyone knew they weren't going to plummet backwards into the plaster, glass, fiber, rock things. Everyone clearly saw as they entered the attraction that there was an opening where they could see the back of Langskips. But there was still a quiet part in everyone's mind, even if it was just one small percent, that wonder the first time they rode Maelstrom that the boat's not going to somehow drop backwards, right? It was such a weird ride that there was just no telling. With Frozen Ever After, you feel safe. Of course nothing crazy is going to happen. As Maelstrom, it was like any weird thing was suddenly possible. Just as things are at their most tense, the Nokian from earlier, or maybe not because I've also read that this is not a Nokian but a rock troll, emerges, or re-emerges, from the stones. Just the head again. So yeah, I don't understand why a water creature would rise from the earth and stones. That still doesn't totally make sense. Anyway, it redirected the Langskip again, this time to plummet forwards down the flume chute. Which sort of leads to the question of whether the rock troll or water troll is a friend or ally, I guess. If they're both the same Nokian, then it's around both times the boat was redirected. So why would it try to kill guests, then save the guests? Or was it always trying to kill the guests? Or, as I said before, was it a different creature completely the second time around? Things just got more and more confounding as the ride went on. In any case, it dropped Voyagers 28 feet down into the North Sea. Again, not too different from the Magic Kingdom's Pirates of the Caribbean when you're dropped into the battle bombardment scene. And though I keep calling the attraction Maelstrom, it was in fact originally called the Sea Venture. One word. It was like adventure along with the sea. I believe this sort of word altering is called catachresis. The logo was not only designed, but was even up outside of the attraction's doors. Now, this whole tumultuous concept for the North Sea scene was why the attraction's name was changed to Maelstrom. It was supposed to be a huge, phenomenal finale, and it wasn't just some immaterial idea. Disney went to all the trouble in really making the scene. There was downpouring rain so extreme that they were going to hand out ponchos before guests climbed aboard, because they were going to get wet. Everything was so exciting. There were gusts of wind, churning waves, and lightning. They even brought in and mounted a Tesla coil. The whole thing was this surreal indoor storm. Instead, what Voyagers got was this giant oil rig and two smaller oil rigs under a stormy sky. The Tesla coil was replaced by a strobe light. As for the crashing waves and rain and wind, that was all replaced for, bubbles. It's just, after knowing what guests almost got with the storming Maelstrom scene, the ending was really lackluster. But it was pretty nice, and the transition from the Nokian to the North Sea oil rigs was fairly startling, but it was all hardly as awe-inspiring as the original concept. And although it's easy enough to assume, I'm still not exactly sure why the changes occurred. I do know that it was deemed too hazardous and there was a safety situation. A Norwegian television reporter is purported to have fallen out of their boat while on a test run through the attraction. Though it's also said this happened on opening day, and that doesn't seem likely, so it's hard to say if that's true. But still, I'm not precisely sure if the decision to tone it down so much happened because of problems in getting the effects to properly coalesce, or because it was so extreme Disney decided to reimagine the scene altogether. Or both. I mean, the lightning arcs of a Tesla coil around all of that water, no matter if it was really altogether safe or not, would still unnerve a lot of people, especially those with children. So I get it. I just don't know what Disney's final reasons were for the changes. Whatever the case, North Shore got their oil rigs though. However, since the scene was so thoroughly restrained, it may as well have kept the title Sea Venture. The fantastical Maelstrom had come and gone before hardly anyone got to ride it. After the oil rig North Sea scene, guests found themselves drifting into the tranquil Norwegian harbor of a fishing village. The business signs and logos were cleverly employed to advertise the actual Norwegian companies that originally sponsored the attraction. And just a side note, the 129 over the door here was put in because Paul Torrigino's birthday is January 29th. But this place really did make you feel transported as though you were completely elsewhere. I remember literally looking around on several trips for something to buy or eat, but there was nothing. The excitement always fell into dismay as I realized I couldn't leave, but are instead waiting to enter a theater that showed a 5-minute film called The Spirit of Norway. Paul Torrigino explained that he really put a lot of effort into making the fishing village as charming and authentic as possible, because he knew it was essentially a holding area for guests until the show doors opened. North Shore really wanted people to sit and learn about Norway. But if you wanted, you could just walk through the theater and exit the attraction once the doors finally opened. But the whole waiting to leave in the fishing village thing always felt like an elaborate holding cell. The Spirit of Norway exhibited the wonders and industry of Norway in 70mm film. For 26 years, the film never changed. It was always the Spirit of Norway. And like I said, Norway couldn't cram everything they wanted into the 3.5-minute attraction, so everything they couldn't convey there was put into the 6-minute Spirit of Norway film. And it was okay, mind you, it just got dated. It not only showcased the modern Norway of 1988, but also displayed the natural beauty and culture of its people. And originally, when the ride was supposed to be 15 minutes long, the Spirit of Norway was supposed to be a pre-show before the attraction. In the mix of all the twists and turns of the attraction and having happened so many decades ago, I still can't say exactly what caused the show to be put at the end. In the attraction's later years, a Norway marketing group became embarrassed by some of the outdated facets of the Spirit of Norway, such as the 80s hairstyles and clothes, so they took it upon themselves to make a new film. I'm not exactly sure how that meeting went, but I do know that when Disney viewed the film, they said it didn't meet their quality standards, and took a step further to add that they should pay Disney to make a fresh new film. But nothing ever came of that. The ride sailed its last voyage on October 5th, 2014, eventually replaced by Frozen Ever After. There was a lot of hoopla and uproar, but Norway had gone as far as selling the pavilion to Disney in 1992, and stopped all financial support in 2002. Disney repeatedly tried to get Norway to update the pavilion at some surprisingly low costs, and went out of their way to contact certain Norwegian groups to try to get Norway to continue its support, but nothing ever came of it. Now, I'm not a super fan of all of the movie-based rides Disney has made over the past 2 decades. It's not that I don't think they're great, I just miss them balancing them out with more original concepts for attractions. I especially miss Epcot's former dedication to science, innovation, and world cultures. But based on how fantastic Frozen was received, and all things considered with Norway, it makes sense that Disney remade Maelstrom into Frozen Ever After. What I mean is, even if you don't like the decision, it makes sense. And if it still riles you that Maelstrom is gone, take some solace that residents of Norway did complain and urge Norway to continue its sponsorship in Epcot after Frozen Ever After was announced. For no other reason than to maintain Norway's integrity with the residents of the United States. But the government still didn't find it to be a worthwhile use of funds. They must have had information others weren't privy to. For all of their feet dragging regarding funding in the 1980s, Norway's tourism did boom due to its presence in Epcot. It's said to have risen as high as 500 to 700% its first year. And there are remnants of Maelstrom throughout the Norway Pavilion though. The Puffin figures after the final drop in Frozen Ever After are actually reused from Maelstrom. Also, the overhead LEDs when Elsa pushes you back in the Let It Go sequence are the same from when it was the three-headed troll scene. In the Royal Sommerhus meet and greet, there's a tapestry of the three-headed troll as well as the rock ogre. And on the Frozen Ever After queue, there's a weather report stating that a maelstrom formed in the southeastern bay of Arendelle. Overall, in spite of its muddled story, Maelstrom was a favorite among Epcot visitors. It was an immersive attraction offering a diverse range of fantasy, danger, and adventure. Expertly and richly designed, it was wondrous in pure 1980s fashion. It shared Norway's culture with a generation of children in a way that was truly fascinating. Its legacy endures more than a decade after its closure, and is one of the more cherished extinct attractions by parkgoers. Ha de bra, and thanks for watching and listening. Disfarers out.